The candles had been lit for an hour already. Minerva McGonagall stood at the front of the great hall and watched the flames settle into their familiar steadiness, the way they always did on the first evening of term. Not flickering, not dramatic, simply burning with the patient certainty of things that had been done the same way for centuries. The enchanted ceiling above had deepened from the pale grey of late afternoon into something closer to ink, the first stars pressing through cloud in ones and twos, unhurried. She had watched the ceiling turn through hundreds of September evenings. It still held her attention, briefly, every time. The hall was full of noise in the way that only a room full of children can be. Not loud exactly, but layered. Older students had settled back into their seats with the ease of people returning to a place that belonged to them. Conversations had picked up mid-sentence, as though summer had been merely a long pause. She could hear from the Gryffindor table the particular laughter of the Weasley twins, already indistinguishable from one another in the candlelight. A third year at Ravenclaw was showing something to her neighbour, a small folded piece of parchment, and they bent over it together in that private way of girls who have spent a summer writing letters. McGonagall turned away from the hall and walked back through the side door toward the chamber where the first years were waiting. She had done this walk so many times that her feet knew it without instruction. The stone corridor was cool and dim, the torchlight lower here than in the hall, and the sounds of the assembled school faded behind her to a murmur. Ahead, she could hear them before she could see them, the particular noise of children who are frightened but trying not to show it, which is a different noise entirely from children who are simply excited. Whispers, a nervous laugh, quickly swallowed. The shuffle of new robes not yet broken in. She paused at the entrance to the chamber and looked at them. 41 this year. She had counted them off the list that morning. 41 names, 41 sets of records forwarded from primary schools and home tutors, and the small informal networks through which wizarding families prepared their children for this. They stood in clusters, the way children do when they don't yet know how to stand alone in a new place, gravitating toward whoever they had spoken to on the train, or whoever simply happened to be nearest when the boats docked. Some of them still had their outdoor cloaks pulled close, despite the warmth. One small girl near the back was holding her own wrist, not quite wringing her hands. McGonagall swept in, and the room came to attention in that instinctive way children have around adults who carry themselves with authority. She gave them the speech she had given every year. The houses, the sorting, the importance of conduct. She was precise and not unkind, but she did not linger. They did not need reassurance so much as direction, and direction she could give. She had nearly finished when she saw him. He was standing toward the middle left of the group, partially obscured by a taller boy with red hair. A Weasley, she noted automatically, the youngest son, she thought, and she might have passed over him entirely if she had not already known to look. He was small, that was the first thing. Small even among the other 11-year-olds, slight in his robes, his dark hair untidy in that way she recognized with a precision that landed somewhere below her ribs and stayed there. He was looking up at the ceiling of the chamber with an expression of open, uncomplicated wonder, not the performed wonder of a child who wants to be seen marveling, but the genuine article, the look of someone encountering something entirely outside the boundaries of what they knew existed. She had known his name for 10 years. She had written it in the margin of a letter the night Albus told her, sitting in her office with the windows open and the sound of the grounds coming in on the autumn air. Harry Potter. She had written it without meaning to, the way one sometimes writes a word that refuses to stay only in the mind. She had not kept the paper, but she had not forgotten the name, and she had not forgotten the weight it carried, the weight that had been placed on a child who was not yet old enough to hold a wand, who had been sleeping in a house in Godric's Hollow while the world outside it came apart. She had argued with Albus about Privet Drive. She had sat outside that house in her animagus form for a full day, watching a street that was relentlessly, aggressively ordinary, watching the neighbors leave for work and return from it, watching a woman who shared Lily's blood go in and out of her front door without once looking up at the sky. She had watched and she had known, with the certainty of someone who had spent 40 years learning to read people, that the boy would not be loved here, sheltered perhaps, fed presumably, but not loved. She had told Albus this. He had listened, as he always listened, with the full attention that made one feel briefly that nothing else existed. And then he had explained, gently and at length, about the protection, about the blood magic, about the necessity. She had understood. She had not agreed. She had done what she always did when she disagreed with Albus on matters he had already decided. She had said so clearly once, and then she had let it be. Now here was the boy. He had stopped looking at the ceiling and was listening to her speak. She had continued talking through all of this, the speech requiring nothing of her now. It came on its own. And she noticed that he listened the way attentive children listen, with his whole face. His eyes were green behind round glasses that sat slightly crooked on his nose, one earpiece bent at an angle that suggested they had been repaired inexpertly or not repaired at all, simply bent back. His robes were clean, but had the look of new things bought in a hurry. She finished speaking and led them out. The procession from the chamber to the great hall was one of the small, reliable pleasures of the year. She walked ahead and did not look back, but she was aware of them behind her, the sound of 41 pairs of feet on stone, the whispered O's as they came around the corner, and the doors opened, and the full brightness of the hall came into view. Every year, the same sound, children encountering something too large and beautiful to stay quiet about. She took her place at the front and watched them file in. The older students were watching too, as they always did, with the benign curiosity of people revisiting a thing they'd already experienced, looking for their own reflections in it. She saw a few of the Gryffindor sixth years leaning to get a better view. The Weasley twins had straightened up and were scanning the line, presumably looking for their younger brother. The first years arranged themselves into a loose group before the stool and the hat, and McGonagall unrolled the list. The hat's song had finished. She had listened to it with the portion of her attention she always gave it, enough to note if it said anything unusually pointed, which occasionally it did, in years when something needed saying. Tonight, it had been philosophical in the way the hat sometimes was, touching on unity and choice, and she had filed it away to consider later. She began to call names. The sorting was its own kind of ritual, and she had long since stopped trying to predict it. The hat had surprised her too many times. She called each name clearly and watched each child approach the stool with their particular version of bravery, some striding, some shuffling. One small boy who walked with his eyes closed. And she noted, as she always did, the moment the hat called out a house, the way the relevant table erupted, the way the child's face changed, relief mostly. Even for the ones who had hoped for one thing and received another, there was usually relief beneath it. The uncertainty was the hard part. Once you knew, you could begin. Potter, Harry. She had said hundreds of names in this hall. She had said them the same way, every one, clearly, without inflection. She said this one the same way too. But the hall did not receive it the same way. There was a ripple. She felt it more than heard it. A change in the texture of the room's noise, a collective intake that moved through the students like wind through grass. Heads turned. Children who had been watching with ordinary attention suddenly sat forward. The name had been a name like all the other names until it landed, and then it became something else entirely, something the room recognized and responded to before it could think to do otherwise. She kept her expression exactly as it was. The boy, Harry, walked to the stool in the silence that had opened up around him. He looked neither left nor right. She found that she respected this, briefly and without sentiment. He sat down. She lifted the hat and placed it on his head, and it dropped forward over his eyes, and she stepped back. She watched the hall more than she watched the stool. This was a habit she had developed over many years of sortings, observing not the child being sorted, but the room around them, the small human weather of reaction and expectation. She could learn a great deal about a year group from how they watched a sorting. Tonight the older students had gone very still, the Gryffindor table in particular. She noted Albus at the head table, his expression folded into something that was not quite serenity and not quite anticipation. The hat took longer than usual, not long enough to be alarming. The hat could take 5 minutes with particularly complex cases, and this was not 5 minutes, but longer than the quick, confident declarations it sometimes made. She could see the boy's hands on his knees, very still. He had good self-possession for 11, or perhaps he was simply too overwhelmed by everything to express individual anxiety. Gryffindor! The table in question erupted in a way that suggested some of them had been holding their breath. She heard the Weasley twins loudly and immediately, and beneath them, the broader wave of applause that rolled down the bench. Harry stepped off the stool and pulled the hat from his head and looked at the Gryffindor table with an expression she could not entirely read from this distance. Something between gratitude and bewilderment, she thought. He handed the hat back to her without looking at her, already being drawn toward the table by the noise and the hands and the space that had opened up to receive him. She set the hat back on the stool and looked back at her list. Thomas, Dean. After the sorting, after the feast, after the prefects had shepherded the first years up the staircases to their dormitories, McGonagall walked back through corridors that were settling into their late evening quiet. The portraits murmured to each other in their frames. A cat she did not recognize, a student's, presumably escaped from a dormitory, pressed itself against the wall as she passed, and then continued on its own business. She went to her office. The room was as she had left it, a little disordered from the preparations of the past week, papers in stacks that knew their own logic, a thin film of chalk dust on the corner of her desk that she had not yet managed to clear entirely. Her tartan biscuit tin sat beside the window. The fire had burned down to a steady amber glow. She did not sit down immediately. She stood at the window for a moment and looked out at the grounds, which were dark now, the lake a flat darkness below the sky. The boats would have been pulled back to their shed by the water's edge. Somewhere down there, 41 children were lying in unfamiliar beds, listening to an unfamiliar castle make its unfamiliar sounds. One of them was Harry Potter. She thought of the boy as she had seen him tonight. The green eyes, the crooked glasses, the steadiness on the stool. She thought of him as she had seen him 11 years ago. Not in person, but in the knowledge of him. A child in a house in Godric's Hollow. The world reordering itself around him while he slept. She was not a sentimental woman. She did not think of herself in those terms, and would have found the description faintly embarrassing. But she had spent 40 years teaching children, and she knew what it meant to watch a child carry something too large for them. She had seen it before, in different ways, in different children, the ones who came to Hogwarts already bearing things they should not have had to bear. She had learned, over those 40 years, that there was very little a teacher could do about the weight itself. The weight was the weight. What you could do was make sure the child knew where they were, make sure they had ground beneath their feet. She would teach him transfiguration. She would expect from him exactly what she expected from every student, no more, no less. This was, she had decided long ago, the only honest gift she had to give. The fair thing, the equal thing, the professional thing. And beneath that, beneath the professional surface of it, the other thing, the thing she would not name, the simple fact of paying attention, of watching, of being someone in the room who knew his name before he arrived and would remember it long after he had gone. She turned from the window and sat down at her desk. She opened the register to the first page, where the new names had been added in her own handwriting that afternoon. She ran a finger down the column without reading it, a habitual gesture, and then she closed it again. The fire settled in the grate with a small sound like a breath. She reached for the biscuit tin. The chalk dust never entirely left the room. McGonagall had noticed this years ago and had since stopped remarking upon it, even to herself. It lived in the grain of the stone, in the fibres of the curtains, in the shallow grooves of the windowsills where generations of students had rested their elbows while pretending to look outside. On bright mornings, when the light came in at a low angle from the east, she could see it suspended in the air. Not unpleasantly, simply present, the way certain things become present in rooms that have held the same activity for long enough. The transfiguration classroom smelled of chalk and old wood and, faintly, of singed parchment, which was the inevitable consequence of teaching magic to children who were still learning the difference between concentration and tension. She arrived 20 minutes before the first years on a Tuesday morning in October. This was not unusual. She arrived 20 minutes before every class as a matter of practice rather than necessity. It was enough time to set the demonstration materials on her desk, to check the light, to stand in a quiet room before it filled with people and collect whatever portion of herself the morning had not yet claimed. The castle was never fully silent, but classrooms before students arrived had their own quality of stillness, deeper than the corridors, more purposeful. She moved through it without disturbing it, setting a row of matchsticks on the front desk, straightening the chairs in the first 2 rows that had been left at angles by the 6th years the previous afternoon. She heard them on the stairs before the door opened. Gryffindor and Slytherin, together for this one. She had arranged the timetable herself and saw the utility in it, the early friction of proximity being better managed in a structured environment than left to develop in corridors. They came in with the particular social geometry of children who were still establishing their allegiances. Gryffindors and Slytherins, not exactly clustering away from each other, not yet, but gravitating toward their own, with the instinctive ease of magnets finding their polarity. She stood at the front and did not speak until they were seated and quiet. When the room had settled, she spoke briefly about what transfiguration was. Not a speech. She had never been given to speeches in classrooms, but a statement, delivered in the same tone she used for everything, clear and without decoration. Magic was precise work, transfiguration more than most. It required that the mind and the will and the wand work in a unity that could not be faked or approximate. She had failed students who had approximate unity. She had passed students whose technique was imperfect, but whose attention was whole. Attention, she told them, was the first tool. Then she transformed her desk into a pig. She had done this for so many years, and with so many groups that she could not have said precisely when she had first done it, only that it had proved itself over time as the correct opening, not a flourish, not a performance, but a demonstration of principle. The desk was a desk, then it was a pig, then it was a desk again. She said nothing during the transformation, letting the silence do the work. She watched their faces. There was always the moment of impact, the collective startle, quickly mastered in the older students, not yet masterable in 11-year-olds who had spent their lives being told that what they had just seen was impossible. Some of them laughed. Some of them went very still. One girl at the back pressed both hands flat on her desk as if checking its integrity. A Slytherin boy in the second row had his mouth open and appeared unaware of it. She noted Harry without making it obvious she was noting him. He was in the third row, which she had not directed. Students chose their own seats. She had always felt that the architecture of a classroom was itself informative. Beside the Weasley boy and one seat over, from a girl with dark skin and quick eyes, whose name she had noted on the register that morning. Lavender Brown was further back. Neville Longbottom, who she had been watching with a separate, careful attention, sat in the second row, alone, as though he had sat down before anyone else arrived, and the chairs around him had filled slowly, cautiously. Harry had watched the transformation the way he had watched the ceiling on sorting night, with a fullness of attention that was not performance. He did not nudge the boy beside him. He did not laugh. He was simply watching, and when the desk reappeared, he looked down at the matchstick on his own desk, and then looked up at her again. And she had the sense, which she occasionally had with students, that something had connected, not understanding exactly, not yet, but the precondition of it, the alignment of interest. She told them to begin. The noise of a first-year transfiguration class was its own particular texture. Not loud. It was never loud. They were too uncertain for noise at this stage. It was the sound of concentration, the scratch of quills on parchment where they were taking notes, the small taps and murmurs of wand work attempted and re-attempted, the occasional soft exclamation, surprised or frustrated, depending on the student. She moved through the room in the way she had always moved through it, steadily, without particular trajectory, available to be stopped, but not soliciting intervention. She corrected wand angles. This was the work of the first month, really. Not transformation, which required weeks more, but the mechanical foundations that transformation rested on. Grip, angle, intention. Most of them were holding too tightly. This was the most common error with new students, this instinctive clutching, as if the wand might be taken away. She said the same thing at each desk. Loosen the grip. Let the wand do what it was made to do. She reached the third row. The Weasley boy, Ron, had his matchstick slightly misshapen at one end, which was more progress than she had expected from a third session, and which she noted without comment. The girl beside them, Hermione Granger, she recalled from the register, home-educated, both parents non-magical, had already produced something that was, if not precisely a needle, at least a matchstick with ambitions in that direction. She was rereading her own notes as she worked, cross-referencing them against her wand movement in a way that was, frankly, better methodology than McGonagall saw from most third years. She paused at Harry's desk. He had the wand at the correct angle. She noted this without showing that she noted it. And his grip was better than most of the room. Not tight, not rigid, though his elbow was slightly too high. He was focused on the matchstick with that same whole-face attention she had observed on sorting night, and she could see from the slight tension in his jaw that he was trying very hard, which was the second most common error, different from not trying hard enough in ways that were difficult to explain to an 11-year-old. She said without stopping, "Lower the elbow, Potter. You're directing the movement from the shoulder. It should come from the wrist." He adjusted immediately. She moved on. She did not give him special attention after that. This was a decision she had made before the term began. Not precisely a decision, more the natural resolution of a question she had turned over during the summer. There would be those, she knew, who would soften their marking for him, who would find reasons to keep him behind after class, to check on him in corridors, to make his experience of Hogwarts cushioned in ways that no student's experience should be cushioned. She did not intend to be among them, not because she did not care. She was aware of herself enough to know that she cared, with a quiet consistency that was more durable than the louder versions, but because she had spent 40 years observing what happened to children who were treated as exceptions, and what happened to them was not invariably good. He would be graded as a student. He would be corrected when he was wrong and credited when he was right. He would be expected to read the chapters she assigned and to attempt the exercises with seriousness and to ask questions when he had them, which she hoped he would. Some students never ask questions, not the timid ones who are afraid to seem ignorant, but also certain capable students who decided early that asking for help was a concession they could not afford. She would watch for that. She came back past the third row near the end of class. Ron Weasley had improved his matchstick to something that had a definite taper at one end, and she gave him 3 out of 5 for effort, which she said aloud without inflection. Hermione Granger had produced a creditable needle and was now, apparently having finished early, reading ahead in the textbook with the focused serenity of someone who has discovered a room they plan to live in. McGonagall said nothing to her. The work spoke clearly enough. Harry had made the matchstick slightly silver at the tip. This was, for a 3rd session, not negligible. She looked at it for a moment without commenting, then tapped it once with her own wand to neutralize the partial transformation. Leaving student work partially done could set unhelpful precedents, and said, "The movement is sound. You're losing the intent at the final wrist turn. That's where the object receives the instruction." He looked up at her. "So I need to think about it as I turn." "You need to intend it. Thinking is not quite the same thing." He considered this with an expression that was not confusion, but something more careful, the look of someone filing information away rather than immediately deploying it. She moved on before he could ask a follow-up question, not because the question wouldn't be useful, but because the answer was one he would arrive at more thoroughly through practice than through explanation. The bell did not ring at Hogwarts in the conventional sense. There was a shift, a subtle one, atmospheric, that students learn to recognize over the first few weeks of term, a change in the quality of light, or perhaps simply a collective awareness that time had moved the way it was meant to move. She dismissed them at this shift, gathering the matchsticks from the front desks and placing them in the small wooden box she kept for the purpose. They left with the organized chaos of 11-year-olds who had somewhere to be and were not entirely certain where that was. Bags gathered, chairs scraped, a brief collision at the door between a Gryffindor and a Slytherin that resolved itself without incident. She watched them go. Neville Longbottom was last, as he frequently was, not from slowness, but from an excess of care in packing his bag, checking twice that he had all his things before moving toward the door. She had been watching him since sorting night, with a particular attention that she kept, as with Harry, from becoming visible. He was not struggling, not yet. He was simply a child carrying the expectation of a history he had no say in. A different kind of weight from Harry's, but weight nonetheless. His grandmother had sent a letter before term began. She had read it and placed it in his file, and not referred to it since. He reached the door and then stopped and turned back. "Professor." She looked up from the box of matchsticks. "I left mine on the desk," he said, holding up the matchstick he had already put in his bag. "I mean, I took the wrong one. This one isn't mine." She looked at the desk he had been sitting at. There was no second matchstick. "I believe that one is yours, Mr. Longbottom." He looked at it. He turned it over in his hand. "Oh," he said. It looks different. Did I?" She looked more closely. The matchstick in his hand had, almost imperceptibly, altered its texture. The grain of the wood slightly finer, the tip just barely tapered, as though the material had rearranged itself by some margin. She doubted he had noticed this himself. "It appears you may have made a beginning," she said, in exactly the tone she used for every student. "Come back to it on Thursday, with the intention, rather than the accident." He looked at the matchstick for another moment, then put it carefully into his bag. more carefully than he had packed the rest of his things, and went out. She stood alone in the room. The chalk dust was visible in the window light, the same as it always was. She set the box on the shelf behind her desk and turned back to the room. Third row, she noted, without meaning to note it particularly. The matchstick she had cleared from Harry's desk was indistinguishable from the others now. She would not have been able to identify it. She sat down at her desk. A pigeon had landed on the outside windowsill and was regarding her with the blank authority of pigeons everywhere. She looked back at it briefly and then opened the register and made her notes for the session in the margins she kept for such things. Not grades, not yet. Simply observations, the kind that accumulated over a term into a picture of who the student was and how they worked. She reached the H column. She wrote 3 words, precise and unremarkable, in her small, even hand. Then she moved on to the next name. The end of term had its own particular silence. Not the silence of emptiness. The castle was never quite empty. There were always the portraits and the ghosts and the particular creak of old stone adjusting itself in summer warmth. But the silence of diminishment, of a place that had been full and was now becoming less so by degrees. The students had left that morning on the Hogwarts Express, and the sound of them had gone with them. The footsteps on staircases, the voices in corridors, the late-night murmurs that she pretended not to hear when she did her evening rounds. All of it departed, punctually, with the train. McGonagall sat at her desk in the late afternoon light and worked through the end-of-term files. This was not the most demanding task of the year, but it was among the more persistent ones. Records to be updated, progress notes to be transferred to the main register, correspondence to be answered or filed or discarded. She had been at it since after lunch and had made reasonable progress, the completed files stacked to her left in a pile that had grown steadily throughout the afternoon, while the untouched pile on her right diminished at an equivalent rate. The window was open. Outside, the grounds had the particular quality of June evenings in the Scottish Highlands. Long light, the air carrying the smell of the lake, and the distant hills, a warmth that felt borrowed, conditional. She worked through the files in register order. Bones, Susan. Boot, Terry. Brown, Lavender. She paused here briefly, noted a concern she had carried since February, wrote 3 lines in the margin, moved on. Bulstrode, Cornfoot, Crabbe, Finch-Fletchley, Finnegan, Seamus, who had improved considerably since November and whose progress note she wrote with a degree of satisfaction she did not show to anyone. Goldstein, Goyle, Granger, Hermione. She stopped at Granger and read back through the year's notes in full before writing the end-of-term summary. This had become her practice with certain students, not the ones who were straightforward, whose trajectories could be summarized in a sentence, but the ones whose files required a longer view. Hermione Granger was not a complicated student in the conventional sense. She was academically among the most capable students McGonagall had taught in 20 years, and she did not require much from that perspective. What she required, and what McGonagall had been quietly attending to since September, was something harder to note in a margin. The girl was lonely in a specific way, the way very capable children are sometimes lonely, surrounded by people but not yet understood by them. This was improving. She had noted this. She wrote it again now, more formally, and then set the file on the completed pile. she worked through to the P's: Parkinson, Patil, Padma, Patil, Parvati, Perks, Sally Ann, Potter, Harry. She lifted the file and held it for a moment before opening it. It was thinner than it should have been. This was something she had noticed in second year and had not been able to entirely set aside since. Not thin in terms of academic records. Those were complete, annotated, consistent. What was missing was the surrounding material, the incidental documentation that accumulated around most students without anyone particularly intending it. Letters from home, forwarded by heads of house, holiday correspondence, the occasional note from a parent responding to a progress report. Most files had a small supplementary section for this kind of material. Some of them were thick with it. She thought of Weasley, Ronald, whose supplementary section contained, among other things, a hand-knitted card from his mother and 3 drawings that his sister had sent without explanation, which had been included in the file without comment by whoever had filed them. Harry's supplementary section had a Gringotts forwarding notice, a single letter she had sent to the Surrey address herself in second year following an incident she had thought warranted a brief note home, and a second letter, unopened, still in its envelope, returned to sender. She had received the return letter without surprise. She was not sure what she had expected. She set it aside now and read through the academic record. He was not Granger. This was, she sometimes thought, the most useless observation one could make about a student, and yet it was the one that certain colleagues could not resist. Measuring him against her, against the expectation of someone who had defeated Voldemort as an infant, and was therefore presumably exceptional in every measurable way. She found this frustrating in a manner she kept private. Harry was a good student who was sometimes a very good student, and occasionally, in specific conditions, something closer to remarkable. His transfiguration had improved steadily across 3 years, the early promise of that first partial transformation in October of first year, developing into a technical proficiency that she would place comfortably in the upper third of the year group. What interested her more than his technical ability was his attention under pressure. She had noticed this first in second year, during the period when the castle had been suffused with a particular anxiety she did not intend to dwell on in a margin note. He had come to class. He had sat down. He had worked. The other students had watched him with a mixture of things: suspicion, fascination, a kind of borrowed fear. And he had simply worked with the same focused expression she had observed in the first session of first year, as though the work itself were a room he could go into and close the door. She respected this. She wrote it in the margin in terms that were more measured than what she actually thought, which was that it was one of the more quietly impressive things she had seen from a third-year student in recent memory, and that she suspected he himself was unaware of it. The summer address was listed, as always, as the Surrey number. She looked at it. 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. She had looked at this address every year, and every year it presented itself to her with the same blank face, telling her nothing except what she already knew, which was that it was an address and not a home in any sense that Hogwarts used the word. She had driven past it once in the first year, in a hire car she had obtained through a Muggle agency near King's Cross. She was not entirely sure why she had done this. It had seemed, at the time, a necessary thing, and she had driven past the house slowly and seen only a neat suburban exterior, curtains drawn on a Tuesday afternoon, a car in the drive that was newer than the neighbors' cars, and parked with a slight precision that said something about the person who had parked it, though she could not have articulated what. She had not stopped. She had driven back to London and returned the car and taken the train to Edinburgh, and not mentioned it to anyone. She wrote the summer address into the forwarding register with the same pen she used for everything. Then she closed Harry's file and placed it on the completed pile. Outside, the light was shifting to the longer gold of early evening. The pigeon that had taken up a habitual post on her windowsill since October. She had stopped being surprised by it, landed now with its usual authority, and regarded the room. She had begun at some point she could not precisely identify to find this mildly companionable. She made tea. This too was a habitual action, end of term and otherwise. The small kettle on the shelf behind her desk, charmed to heat without fire. The particular green tin of loose leaf she had ordered from a muggle shop in Edinburgh for the better part of 20 years. She made it without measuring, her hands knowing the amount by long practice, and she stood at the shelf while it steeped and looked at the completed pile of files. 41 names, this year's first years, now third years. She had learned them the way she always learned a year group, gradually, by accumulation, the picture building from fragments across 3 years, until she had something comprehensive enough to be useful. They were good students, as a group, better than average in terms of effort, if not uniformly in terms of ability. She had favorites, as she always had favorites, though she kept this to herself with the discipline of long practice. A teacher who showed favorites was a teacher who had stopped doing their job properly. The feeling was permissible. The expression of it was not. She poured the tea. She sat back down and looked at the remaining files. The 4th years, the 5th years, the 6th and 7th years with their examinations and their futures and their particular weight. She would work through them in order. She would finish by dinner or close enough to dinner that the remainder could wait until morning. She opened the next file. The castle made a sound somewhere above her. Not a footstep, not a voice, simply the settling of old stone in summer warmth. The same sound it made every year at this time, as though the building itself were releasing something held through the long months of occupation. She had lived within these walls for long enough that she no longer consciously registered most of what the castle said. It was simply present, the way the chalk dust was present, the way the evening light was present, part of the texture of the place. She worked until the light through the window turned amber and the pigeon departed without ceremony. The completed pile grew. The remaining pile shrank. She did not hurry and she did not dawdle, and when she finally set down her pen in the long northern dusk and looked at the 2 piles, one finished, one not quite, she allowed herself a moment of stillness before closing the register and standing. The files would keep until morning. She banked the fire, rinsed her cup, and stood briefly at the open window before closing it. The grounds were very quiet now. The lake held the last of the light in the way it always did at midsummer, flat and silver, patient. Somewhere below the tree line a bird she could not name called twice, and then was silent. She turned back to the room. The completed files sat in their pile, squared and still. She would have them transferred to the main records room in the morning, where they would join the decades of previous files in the careful dark of the archive. Other years, other names, other margins full of observations that had seemed important at the time. She picked up Harry's file. She stood with it for a moment, not reading it, not opening it, simply holding it. And then she placed it squarely on top of the pile. She switched off the lamp and went to dinner. The corridors were never quite the same after the goblet. McGonagall could not have said precisely what had changed. The stone was the same stone. The torches burned at the same intervals. The portraits continued their habitual commentary on the weather and the quality of the current generation of students, which they found, as every generation of portraits had found every generation of students, wanting in specific and consistent ways. Nothing structural had altered, and yet the castle had a different quality in the weeks following the Triwizard announcement, something in the air that she recognized without being able to name, the particular atmosphere of a place in which something has happened that should not have happened, and everyone is aware of this, and no one is saying so directly. She had not slept well for the better part of a week. This was not something she would have said aloud. She had mentioned it to no one and did not intend to. She was 68 years old and had taught at Hogwarts through circumstances that had tested her composure in ways she would not enumerate, and she had maintained through all of it the quality of professional steadiness that she considered not a performance, but a genuine orientation, a decision made long ago and renewed quietly each morning about how she intended to meet whatever the day contained. The night Harry's name had come out of the goblet, she had maintained this steadiness in the room and in the subsequent discussion with Albus and the other heads and Bartemius Crouch, and she had maintained it in the corridor afterward when she had found herself standing alone for a moment outside the room where they had taken Harry, and she had maintained it all the way back to her office, where she had sat for 40 minutes without lighting the lamp and without making tea and without doing anything at all. She had been angry, not at Harry. This was never a question in her mind. She had looked at his face when his name was read, and she knew what she saw. But at the situation, at the machinery of it, at whatever hands had arranged the pieces into this configuration, a 14-year-old boy. She thought of the supplementary section of his file, thin as it was. She thought of the returned letter. She had sat in the dark for 40 minutes, and then she had lit the lamp and made the tea and gone to bed. She saw him in the corridor on a Thursday morning, 9 days after the announcement. She was walking from her office to the Transfiguration classroom for the 9 o'clock fourth-year session, a walk she had done so many thousands of times that she could have done it in complete darkness, which once, during a particularly creative student prank in 1987, she had been required to do. She turned the corner at the 3rd floor, and he was there, coming the other direction, his bag over one shoulder, slightly too low so that it knocked against his hip as he walked. He was with Ron Weasley, or rather, he was walking beside Ron Weasley, which was not quite the same thing. She registered this immediately, the way she registered the small social weathers of her students without appearing to look for them. They were not speaking. They were walking in the practice parallel of two people who are accustomed to walking together and who are, currently not talking, which was a different quality of silence from the silence of strangers. Something had come between them. She did not know the specifics and did not need to. She had watched enough friendships fracture under pressure to recognize the symptoms. She met Harry's eyes briefly as they passed. She gave him the same acknowledgement she gave every student she passed in corridors. A slight nod, minimal, the standard currency of Hogwarts passage, and she continued on her way. She did not stop. There was nothing to say. This was the thing she had learned over 40 years, with more difficulty than she would have predicted when she was young, and believed that the right words, correctly applied, could address most situations. There were simply circumstances in which a teacher had nothing to offer a student, except continued presence. The ongoing fact of being in the room, of the lessons continuing, of life at the castle proceeding in its ordinary rhythms around whatever extraordinary thing had descended. Sometimes that was the only gift available. She had not always found it sufficient. She had given it anyway. She turned into the classroom corridor, and the sound of them behind her, 2 pairs of footsteps, not quite synchronized, faded and was gone. The 4th year session was on switching spells. She taught it with the attention she gave every lesson, which was complete. This was not always easy. There had been years, the bad years, the years she did not name even to herself except in the most oblique way, when she had stood at the front of her classroom and delivered the content of the lesson from behind a composure that cost her something real to maintain. She had always considered this cost acceptable. The students in front of her had not chosen to sit in her classroom during a difficult year. They deserved the lesson. Today the 4th years were attempting to switch the properties of a ceramic cup and a glass marble, a standard switching exercise with clear success criteria and a predictable range of errors. She moved through the room with the methodical ease of long practice, correcting, redirecting, occasionally demonstrating on her own materials at the front. She was at the window end of the room when she heard, from somewhere below, the particular noise of a large group of students in outdoor space. Not the usual noise of the grounds between classes, more organized than that, with a directional quality that suggested movement toward a specific destination. She did not go to the window. Whatever it was would become known through the usual channels, the extraordinary speed with which information moved through the student population of Hogwarts, which had always impressed her despite herself. After class, she learned it had been a delegation from Durmstrang arriving on the grounds. She noted this and filed it and went on to the afternoon sessions. She passed the Champions Weigh-In on a Friday without attending it herself. This was Albus's domain and Ludo Bagman's and the ministry officials who had been occupying the upper corridors with the persistent confidence of people who believed their presence was welcome. She had been invited and had sent her regrets with the formal courtesy she used for ministry occasions. She had a 5th year session on Friday afternoons that she saw no reason to cancel, and which she did not cancel. She heard afterward, through Pomona, that Harry had handled himself quietly. She was not surprised by this. She was, in the way she was sometimes surprised to find herself, a small increment more settled. The week after the first task was confirmed, she found Neville Longbottom sitting outside her classroom before the Monday morning session, 40 minutes early, doing nothing in particular, not reading, not doing homework, simply sitting on the floor with his back against the wall and his bag between his knees. She had opened the classroom door for her own early arrival and found him there and had stopped. "Mr. Longbottom, you're aware the session begins at 9. "Yes, Professor." "Sorry." He started to gather himself, reaching for his bag. "I can wait somewhere else." "You may come in," she said, after a moment. He came in. He sat at his usual desk. She went to her own desk and continued her preparation without making conversation. And he sat at the desk and did not make conversation either. And this arrangement was satisfactory to both of them. She was aware of him in her peripheral vision. Not anxious, she thought, or not only anxious. More the look of someone who needed to be inside walls for a while. She understood this. The castle did that for people who knew how to let it. She did not ask him why he had come early. He would tell her if he wanted to, or he would not, and either was acceptable. She had found over decades of teaching that children often did not want to be asked. What they wanted was to be let in. Before the other students arrived, he said quietly, "Professor, is it true the first task is dangerous?" She looked up from her papers. She considered the honest answer, which was yes, and the reassuring answer, which would have been a version of no, and she gave him neither of those exactly. "The tournament has safeguards," she said. "The champions are not unprotected." He nodded slowly, as though this was not quite what he had asked, but was something. "He'll be all right, won't he?" he said. Not quite a question. She looked at him for a moment. "Get your textbook out, Mr. Longbottom," she said. "We'll start the review early." He got his textbook out. She saw Harry again the following Tuesday in the late afternoon. She was returning from the staff room, and he was coming out of the library, alone this time, with 3 books under his arm that were not transfiguration texts. She recognized the spines, reference works, charm theory, something she thought might be from the restricted section with a library pass. Albus's handwriting on the slip that was visible where it had slipped part way out from between the pages. He was walking quickly, with the particular focused expression she had seen in her classroom in first year, when he had silenced the world outside him and sat down with the problem directly in front of him. He didn't see her until he was nearly level. He stopped. "Professor." "Mr. Potter." A beat. He shifted the books under his arm. She had the unreasonable impulse, which she did not follow, to ask him how he was. Not in the way of corridors and formality, genuinely, in the way one person asks another when they mean the question. She had not asked him this in 4 years. She was not certain it would have been the right thing in any of those years to ask him this. He was not a student who invited this kind of question, or perhaps she was not a teacher who knew how to offer it, or perhaps it was simply the nature of the distance between them, professional and necessary, and the right distance for the kind of care she was able to give. She said, "The library closes at 8 on weekdays." "I know," he said. "I'll be done before then." She nodded once. He went on his way. She stood in the corridor for a moment, after he had turned the corner, the way she had stood in the corridor the night his name came out of the goblet, not doing anything, simply occupying the space for a moment before returning to the ordinary motion of the evening. The torches along the wall burned with their usual steadiness. She walked back to her office, sat down, and picked up the essay she had been marking before the staff room. The work continued. The castle continued. She picked up her pen and found her place again on the page, and outside in the darkening corridor, the sound of the castle settled around her like something familiar, like something that had always been there and would continue to be there, long after all of them had gone. She kept the door closed that year, not locked. She had never locked her classroom door during a session. It was not her practice, and she did not intend to make it her practice now, but closed, which was a departure from her usual habit of leaving it slightly ajar during lessons, enough to let the corridor air in and the chalk dust out. She had closed it on the first Monday of term, without announcing she was doing so, and without explaining it to herself with any precision, and she had kept it closed every session since. The window she left cracked. This too was not something she examined closely. The window faced east, away from the main courtyard, away from the direction from which certain things came that year. In the mornings, the light through it was clean and direct, and fell across the front desks in a way that was, if not pleasant exactly, then at least honest. She taught the 5th years on Monday and Wednesday mornings. Owl Year was its own particular country. She had taught through dozens of them, and each was the same in structure and different in atmosphere, depending on the year group and depending on what else was happening in the castle around them. The 5th years this year were sitting their examinations in June, and they knew it, most of them, with a sobriety that the previous year's tournament had perhaps accelerated in ways that would not fully show themselves until later. They came to her sessions with their textbooks already open, their notes from the previous lessons spread on the desk beside them, a readiness that she appreciated without sentimentalizing. She stood at the front and taught. This was still, after all the years, the thing she was most purely herself doing. Not the administrative work, not the head of house responsibilities, not the staff room negotiations that had become more wearing than usual this term, but the teaching, the standing in front of a room and delivering content with precision and watching it land, watching the moment when a student's expression shifted from effort to something closer to comprehension. She had been doing it for long enough that she could distinguish between the two without being obvious about looking for them. She taught vanishment in October. She taught it with the door closed and the window cracked, and 30 students in front of her and the usual sounds of the castle going on around them, distantly, neutrally, the way sound went on when you were inside a closed room and paying attention to something else. She made no reference to anything beyond the content. This was the decision she had made at the start of term and renewed each morning. Her classroom would be what it had always been. The subject would be the subject. The students would be treated as students. She thought this was the most useful thing she could offer. She was not entirely sure she was right. Harry sat in the 3rd row. He had sat in the 3rd row since first year, not always the same precise desk. There had been some migration across 5 years, a drift of a seat or two in either direction, but broadly the 3rd row, which she had long since stopped finding remarkable and had simply incorporated into her map of any given session. He was beside Granger, as he frequently was when the seating was open, with Weasley on the other side of Granger, the 3 of them arranged in their habitual configuration, with the habitual ease of people who have shared proximity for long enough that it requires no management. He was thinner this year than he had been in 4th year. She had noticed this in September and had not remarked on it. It was not something she could address through transfiguration, and it was not the kind of observation that bore acting on directly. She had no information that warranted a formal concern, only the eye of someone who had been watching the same student across 5 years and could detect variance. She had noted it in the margin of her copy of the register and left it there. He was working. This was something she could say with consistency about him across all 5 years, that he worked when he came to her classroom, that he brought his attention fully into the room and left outside whatever was outside. She had seen this quality tested in 4th year by circumstances that would have broken the concentration of most adult wizards. It had not broken his. He had sat in the 3rd row and worked. This year the quality had a different texture. There was something compressed about him. She observed this over the first weeks of term, the way she observed most things about her students, laterally, without making it the direct object of her attention. He was working with the same consistency she had always seen from him, but beneath it there was a kind of effortfulness that had not been there before, or that had been there but less visible, as though the work required a decision each time, a conscious setting aside of something, rather than the more natural absorption she had previously watched. She found this both understandable and difficult to see. She said nothing about it. In November, she handed back the first marked essays of the term. Granger's was first, as a consequence of register order and not intention, though she was aware that certain colleagues would have found a way to make the distinction. She placed it face down on the desk in the way she returned all essays, comments visible to the student first, before the grade, in the belief that the response to one's work should begin with the content of the response, rather than the number that summarized it. She had held this belief for 30 years and had been unable to persuade most of her colleagues to adopt it, which she found unremarkable and mildly disappointing in equal measure. She moved down the row. Weasley's essay had improved from his 4th year work in ways that were genuine and incremental. She had given him 6.5 out of 10 with a marginal note that was specific about what the half point represented and how it might be recovered in the next essay. He flipped it over and looked at the grade with an expression she had seen on his face since 1st year. The look of a person who is satisfied with something and would prefer not to appear satisfied, for reasons best known to himself. She set Harry's essay on his desk. He turned it over. She had given him 7 out of 10, which was accurate. The essay had 3 strong sections, and one that lost its argument partway through and did not recover it before the conclusion. She had written the argument dissolves at the 3rd paragraph. Find the thread and follow it to the end in the margin, which was the kind of note she gave when she thought the student was capable of more than the work showed, and would benefit from knowing precisely where the more had gone missing. He read the note. He read it again. He looked up briefly in the general direction of the front of the room, rather than at her specifically. She had already moved on. December came with the early dark and the cold that settled into the stones of the castle, in a way that the fires in the rooms addressed, but never entirely resolved. She wore her robes slightly heavier from the 1st of the month, a concession to the season she made without comment. The 5th years had a revision session on the last Wednesday before the holidays. She had structured it as a working class rather than a lecture. They had their books, they had their notes, they had specific questions she had prepared and written on the board, and she moved through the room while they worked. This was a format she used selectively, in the belief that students could do useful things with silence and materials if given the right frame, and that watching them work independently told her things about their understanding that structured lessons sometimes obscured. She came to the third row, near the end of the session. Granger had filled 2 pages of notes and was beginning a third. Weasley had half a page and had spent the remaining time looking out the window with what she suspected was less idleness than it appeared. He had a way of processing things externally, of seeming elsewhere while actually working, which she had observed since second year, and which she found, if not entirely reassuring, at least characteristic. Harry had a page of notes. She looked at them without appearing to look at them, a skill like most of the skills she had developed over 40 years, so habitual now as to be essentially invisible. The notes were good, clearer than his essay prose, more structured. The argument she had said was missing from the 3rd paragraph of the essay, present here in condensed form. She wondered, not for the first time, whether he found the constraint of formal essay structure genuinely limiting, or whether there was some other variable that affected his written work specifically. She did not ask. At the bottom of the page, he had written something that was not notes, a single line set apart from the rest, without context. She read it in the half-second she had, and did not let her expression change. It said, she was there at the beginning. She did not know what it referred to. It might have referred to any number of things. She moved on to the next desk. She thought about it, briefly, twice more during the session, and then set it aside with the discipline that 40 years of teaching other people's interior lives had given her. Not her business, not her margin to annotate, not her thread to follow. At the end of the session, she dismissed them for the holidays. They left with the specific energy of students released into 2 weeks of freedom. Bags gathered quickly, chairs pushed back, a collective lightening that was almost atmospheric, the room changing quality as they filed out. She watched them go in the way she always watched them go, noting each one briefly, the habitual inventory of a teacher who has learned that the last moment of a term is sometimes as informative as any single lesson within it. Harry was nearly last. He stopped at the door and looked back into the room, not at her, at the room itself, the way people sometimes look at a room they are leaving, a look that is not quite nostalgia and not quite inventory, but something in between, a kind of marking of the fact of the place. Then he went. She stood in the room that had been full and was now empty. In the silence that returned so quickly, it was as if the students had never been there at all, which was one of the reliable small strangeness of this work, the completeness of the absence when they left, and the completeness of the presence when they arrived, and the way she spent her life moving between the two. She began to gather the question sheets from the desks. 3rd row. She collected them in order, setting them into the stack without looking at them individually. The window, still cracked, let in the cold air and the faint smell of the grounds in December, frost and pine and the particular clean emptiness of Scottish winter. She closed the window. She turned off the lights and went into the corridor, which was empty and dim, and carried the sound of the castle settling into its holiday self, quieter, slower, the way it was when it held fewer people. She walked back toward her office with the question sheets under her arm, and the session already converting itself, in the practiced economy of her mind, into notes, observations, the accumulated record of another term in which she had stood in front of students and given them what she had to give. The corridor was very quiet. She walked until it turned, and turned with it, and the transfiguration classroom was behind her, and the afternoon was ahead. The desk was in the third row. She had not moved it. This was not a decision she had made consciously, or not entirely. It was more that she had not made the other decision, the one that would have resulted in the desk being moved, and the absence of that decision had produced the same outcome as intention. The room had been rearranged at the start of term in the way she rearranged it every year. Chair straightened, the front demonstration table shifted a quarter-inch to the right to better align with the window light. The desks had been wiped down, the chalk ledge had been cleared and restocked. Everything had been set to its beginning position for a new year. The desk in the third row remained where it had always been. She taught the 6th years on Tuesday mornings. They were not his year group. His year group was not here, or not in the numbers it should have been. She did not look at the gaps in the register directly, but she was aware of them, the way one is aware of a sound that has stopped, through its absence rather than its presence. The 6 years who sat in front of her on Tuesday mornings were a different cohort, a year younger, and they arrived in her classroom with the same mixture of readiness and anxiety that any 6th year cohort brought to the first session of Newt-level transfiguration. She taught them. This was what she did. The content was the content. She had taught it for 40 years and would teach it for however many more years the castle required it of her, with the same precision and the same expectation and the same movement through the room at the same steady pace. She did not modify her teaching for difficult years. She had considered this carefully early in her career, when the first difficult year had presented itself, and she had concluded that modification was the wrong response, that what a student needed from a classroom in a difficult year was exactly what a classroom was supposed to provide in any year: structure, content, someone at the front who had not changed. She had held this position through everything. She held it now. October came with rain that lasted for 11 days without significant interruption. She noted this because it affected the castle in specific ways she had learned to anticipate across 5 decades. The stone corridors darkened and stayed dark, the torches compensating with a brightness that felt, in the mornings, slightly effortful. The grounds beyond the windows were grey and wet, and the trees at the edge of the forbidden forest disappeared into low cloud that sat on the hillside like something permanent. Students came to class damp around the edges, their robes carrying the outdoor smell of a highland autumn. She stood at the front of her classroom, and the rain ran down the windows behind her, and she taught. She covered human transfiguration in the 3rd week. This was always among the more demanding units of Newt preparation, not technically. The mechanics were learnable, but psychologically, because it required students to perform transfiguration on themselves, which activated in most of them a reserve of caution They did not bring to inanimate objects or animal transfiguration. She had developed, over many years, a sequence of exercises that approached the unit gradually, beginning with partial transfiguration of peripheral structures, fingernails, hair, before moving to more complex work. She demonstrated on herself, as she always did. She transfigured her left hand entirely to stone, smooth grey granite, weight-bearing, cold, and held it up for the room to see, and then returned it to its original state in a single, clean movement. She did this without expression, as a matter of instruction rather than performance, and the room received it with the silence that this demonstration always produced, the brief recalibration that happened when students saw something they knew was possible, performed with complete ease by someone for whom it had become ordinary. A girl in the front row said, quietly and apparently to herself, "It's cold, isn't it? The stone." "Considerably," McGonagall said. "Begin." She did not mark Harry's chair. She wanted to be precise about this in her own mind. There was no ritual, nothing she could accurately have described as an acknowledgement. The desk sat in the third row, and she taught her lessons and moved through the room in her habitual pattern, and the desk was part of the room the way all the desks were part of the room. It was simply that when she moved through the room, she did not move past the third row desk in the way she moved past the others. She could not have explained the distinction adequately. It was something in the pace, something in how she oriented herself within the space of the classroom, a minor navigational habit that had developed without her planning it. She did not stand at the desk. She did not look at it directly. She simply moved around the room differently than she would have moved if the desk had not been there, or had been occupied by someone else. She noticed this in November and noted it to herself and did not change it. The castle was different this year. She had been here through every kind of difficult year the castle had produced since 1956, and each year had its own quality of difficulty, its own texture. She had learned over that span of time not to compare them to each other, which was a form of false accounting. Each year asked what it asked, and the comparison to other years was not useful information. But she had also learned to read the castle's atmosphere with some precision, the way a sailor reads weather, not by naming it, but by attending to the specific configuration of signs. This year the signs were of a specific kind. There was fear in the corridors, not the large theatrical fear that announced itself, but the smaller, more durable variety, the fear that had moved in and made itself comfortable, that showed itself in the way students walked in pairs where they had previously walked alone, in the way conversations stopped when a teacher rounded a corner, in the particular quality of the silences at mealtimes, which were more frequent and more complete than usual. She taught through it. She walked the corridors on her evening rounds with the same steady pace she had always used, and she held herself in the same way, straight, deliberate, unhurried. This was its own kind of communication, the most honest kind she had available. She was here. She had not changed. The classroom would be the classroom tomorrow as it had been today. She believed this was useful. She was not always sure. She received a letter from Molly Weasley in December. It arrived with the morning post, which she sorted at her desk before the day's first session. Memos, administrative correspondence, the occasional personal letter from former students or colleagues elsewhere. The Weasley letter was identifiable before she opened it by the handwriting, which she recognized from 7 years of permission slips and the 3 drawings she had filed without comment in Ron Weasley's supplementary section. She opened it. It was not long. It asked, in the careful circumlocution of someone who understood that letters could be read by the wrong people, whether she had any news of the 3 of them, whether they were— It used the word safe, and then crossed it out and wrote well, and then left both words standing, crossed out and replacement together. She sat with it for a moment. She had no news. She had heard nothing through any of the channels available to her that she could in good conscience report as information rather than speculation. She knew what Albus had left in place, what structures of protection and instruction he had built before he— She did not finish this thought in a direction that was not useful. She wrote back the same afternoon. She wrote carefully, in the same circumlocution the letter had used, and she said what she could say honestly, and no more than that. And she said one additional thing that she had not planned to say when she sat down, which was that she thought of them, and that this mattered. And she sealed the letter before she could reconsider the second part. The reply from Molly Weasley arrived 3 days later and was brief and did not address what McGonagall had added, which she thought was probably the right response from both of them. January was quiet in the way of a held breath. She marked the 6th year essays on a Sunday evening with the fire well built and the window dark and the castle settled around her in its winter configuration. Lower sounds, deeper silences, the portraits more talkative in compensation for the reduced human population of the corridors. She had learned to find the companionable quality in this, the particular character of the castle in its quieter register. She marked steadily through the pile. At some point in the middle of the marking, she became aware that she had stopped reading the essay in front of her and was looking instead at the far wall of the office, at nothing specific, the middle distance that opens up sometimes when the mind has drifted without announcing its departure. She did not know how long she had been looking at it. She looked down at the essay. She found her place. She continued marking. The fire shifted in the grate, resettling itself, and the castle made whatever sound the castle made in January at this hour. Old stone, old wood, the particular voice of a building that had stood long enough to have a voice of its own. She had lived within it for so long that the sound was indistinguishable now from silence, present in the way breathing is present, noticed only in its hypothetical absence. She finished the essay. She set it on the completed pile. She reached for the next one. Outside, the grounds were dark and cold, and the castle stood in them the way it had always stood, and the third-row desk sat in the empty classroom 2 corridors away in the dark, and the rain that had returned after a brief January pause ran down the windows in the patterns that water makes when it has nowhere particular to go but down. She worked until the fire needed building again. Then she built it and returned to her desk and went on. The castle was still burning in places, not catastrophically. The worst of it had been contained through the night by the efforts of people she would not let herself think about individually yet, because if she began she would not be able to stop, and there was still work to do. But there were sections of the eastern corridor where the stone had cracked under heat, and the smell of smoke had moved through the whole building and settled into everything, the curtains and the tapestries and the very air of the rooms, so that breathing was a continuous low reminder of the night that had just passed. She had not slept. She had been moving since before midnight, through corridors, down staircases, giving instructions and receiving them, doing the 100 necessary things that needed doing in a castle that had become, in the space of a few hours, something other than what it had been for 1,000 years. She had fought. She had done what she was trained to do and what the moment required, and she had not stopped to examine any of it because examination was not what the moment required, and she was 68 years old and had learned through the long catalogue of difficult years that examination had its time, and this was not it. Now, in the strange suspended hour before dawn, the immediate urgency had shifted. She was standing at a window on the 3rd floor. She did not know precisely what had brought her here. She had been walking with a purpose, some errand or instruction she could no longer reconstruct, and she had turned a corner and found herself in this corridor, at this window, with the ground spread out below her in the particular darkness that precedes the first light, not quite black, a darkness that had already begun, almost imperceptibly, to consider lifting. She stood at the glass and looked out. The grounds were not empty. She could see movement below, distant figures, the residue of a battle that had paused rather than concluded, students and teachers and others she could not identify at this distance and in this light, moving through the grass with the slow, purposeful uncertainty of people who have been through something enormous and are still inside it, still trying to understand its edges. The lake was flat and dark. The forbidden forest stood at the boundary of the torchlight's reach and then disappeared into itself. She watched and did not move. Her hands were on the stone of the windowsill, which was cold in the way that castle stone is always cold in the early morning, regardless of the season. And she became aware of this coldness gradually, the way one becomes aware of physical sensation when the mind returns to the body from wherever it has been. She pressed her hands flat against the stone and let it be cold. The sky above the forest had lightened by perhaps 1 degree of grey. She saw him before she understood what she was seeing. This was how she would have described it afterward, if she had described it, which she did not. There was a moment of perception before there was comprehension, the way sometimes a thing is registered by the eye before the mind has assembled the meaning of it. A figure crossing the grounds, moving away from the castle, moving with a specific directness that she had observed before, in a different context, in a different year, a particular quality of intention that she had filed away across 17 years of watching the same person move through the world. She knew his walk. She had known it since first year. The slight forward lean, not quite a hunch. The pace that was always slightly faster than the situation seemed to require, as though he were perpetually slightly late for something, or perpetually expecting that the thing he was moving toward might not stay where it was if he didn't reach it quickly. She had seen it in corridors and in classrooms and on the Quidditch pitch and in the Great Hall, and once, memorably, retreating down a 3rd-floor corridor at 2 in the morning in first year, when he had no business being in a 3rd-floor corridor at 2 in the morning. And she had known it then, and she knew it now. Harry, he was alone. She stood at the window and she watched him cross the grounds, and she did not move, and she did not call out, and she did not go to the door at the end of the corridor that would have taken her down a staircase and out onto the grounds in time. She was not certain in time for what, and this uncertainty was not something she allowed herself to examine directly while she was still standing at the window. She watched him walk. She had carried his name for 17 years. She had written it in the margin of a letter and then not kept the paper, but kept the name, carried it the way you carry things you have not decided to carry, but find yourself carrying nonetheless, not as a burden, not exactly, more as a fact of orientation, a fixed point that the rest of certain considerations arrange themselves around. She had said it hundreds of times in registers and on staircases and in the great hall on sorting night and in her classroom when his elbow was too high and his intention was dissolving at the final wrist turn. She had given him 7 out of 10 and written in the margin and moved on. She had not stopped him in corridors when there was nothing a professor could say to a 14-year-old carrying what he was carrying. She had taught his year group for 7 years and marked his essays and corrected his wand angle and said his name in the same tone she used for every name and watched him from the front of a classroom where he sat in the 3rd row and worked with his whole face. And she had believed, she had genuinely believed that this was the right thing, the fair thing, the equal thing, the thing that respected him as a student rather than as a symbol or a wound or a debt the world had decided it was owed. She still believed this. She was also standing at a window watching him walk toward the forest. He reached the edge of the light. There was a boundary. She could see it from the window, the place where the torchlight and the first grey of the approaching dawn gave out, and the forest began. The darkness there, absolute and complete. He reached it, and he did not slow. She watched him walk into it, and then he was simply gone. The darkness having taken him as it takes all things that enter it, completely and without visible transition. She stood at the window. She had one hand pressed flat against the glass now, she discovered. She did not remember moving her hand to the glass. The stone of the sill was cold beneath her other hand. The glass was cold against her palm. The sky above the forest had moved another degree toward the grey of early morning, and she could see, now that she was looking for it, the very first differentiation between the sky and the tree line, the trees becoming visible against the sky in a way they had not been visible 10 minutes ago. She did not go after him. She understood what she had seen. She was not a woman who could be protected from understanding by incomprehension. She had been at Hogwarts too long, had sat in too many rooms with Albus, had read between too many lines of too many carefully worded things he had said over too many years. She understood the nature of the protection and what it ultimately required, and she had understood it, she thought now, for longer than she had allowed herself to know she understood it. A boy who should have simply been a student. She had thought this before, in these words, or words close enough to these to be the same thought. She could not remember the first time she had thought it, only that it had been recurring, that it had arrived periodically across 17 years in quiet moments, in the space after marking and before the next task, in the dark of her office when she had sat for 40 minutes without lighting the lamp. He had been 11 years old when she first saw him in the chamber before the sorting. He had been looking at the ceiling with the expression of a child who has encountered something too large and beautiful to stay quiet about, and she had already known his name for 10 years, had been carrying it for 10 years, and she had stood at the front of the room and given them all the speech about houses and conduct, and she had not singled him out, because singling him out would have been the wrong thing, and she had known it was the wrong thing, and she had been right. She had been right. She pressed her forehead briefly against the cold glass of the window. The sky continued to lighten. It was the slow, committed lightening of a morning that intended to arrive regardless of what the night had contained. Impartial, incremental. The darkness retreating, not dramatically, but by degrees. The way most retreats happen, gradually, and then not. The tree line sharpened. The lake appeared. The grounds below the window were becoming visible in a way they had not been 20 minutes ago. She lifted her head from the glass. Her reflection looked back at her briefly, superimposed on the grounds outside. Her own face, older than she always expected when she encountered it unexpectedly. The lines of it more settled than severe, she thought, though she was aware she was not the most objective reader of her own face. She looked at it for a moment, and then looked through it at the grounds. The forest was still dark. It would stay dark after the rest of the grounds had come fully into morning, as it always did. The trees thick enough to hold the night longer than the open land. She knew this. She had watched it happen every year she had been at Hogwarts, the castle waking into light while the forest kept its own hours. She did not know what was happening in the forest. She knew what she had understood, and she knew that understanding and knowing were not the same thing. And she knew that the difference between them was, at this particular moment, something she had no framework for and no practice with, because she had spent 40 years learning to know things rather than simply understand them, and this was a thing that could only be understood and waited for, and not, in any way, known until it resolved itself. She was not good at waiting. She had never been good at waiting. She stood at the window. The first real light came from the east, which was behind the castle, and announced itself on the grounds below her as a slow increase in the quality of the grey, rather than any single visible change. The grass becoming grass-coloured, the paths becoming distinguishable from the grass, the whole of the visible world assembling itself out of its nighttime generalizations into its specific daytime particulars. Below the window, figures were still moving. She watched them without identifying them individually. They were simply people moving on the grounds of the castle in the early morning after the longest night, doing the things that people do when something has ended and they are not yet certain what has ended and what has not. She stayed at the window. She had nowhere to go that was more important than this window. At this moment, with the forest still holding its dark at the edge of the grounds and the sky continuing its impartial lightening, and the castle behind her making its sounds, the sounds she had been hearing for 50 years, the stone and the wood and the particular deep continuity of a building that had stood through more than this and would, she thought, stand through this also. She waited. The forest held its dark. The light continued to come. She kept her hand against the cold glass, and she stood in the corridor that smelled of smoke, and she waited the way she had always done the things she found most difficult, without showing it, without naming it, with the full weight of her attention given to the thing in front of her and the long practice of a woman who had learned over a lifetime in this castle that some things could only be witnessed. The sky above the tree line was nearly grey now, nearly morning. She waited,